Hey guys, Tom Barclay here, just doing my video on the embargo section of Ange Postecoglou's pre-West Ham press conference. Like I said, I would, just because there's some interesting points he made looking back at the Brighton game, which I know has been hanging over every Tottenham fan ever since it happened. That's sort of unforgettable and horrific second half, where Tottenham went from 2-0 down to lose 3-2, becoming the first club in Premier League history to lose 10 games in the Premier League, having been 2-0 up at one point, or at least 2 goals up, which has led to many, including myself, talking about this Spursy tag, which Tottenham fans hate to hear. And I'll get onto some of the comments he made about that in a minute. But it's just been interesting because he's obviously had 2 weeks to stew on that result, which completely brought 5 straight wins to a juddering halt, and had a lot of fans sort of even looking back at those 5 wins and reassessing how impressive they were and how maybe they'd got away with it a few times in some of those games. Obviously Coventry, arguably Ferencváros and Karabag, where they gave up a lot of chances. I thought Brentford, despite conceding early, was a pretty convincing win, and the same goes for Man United. But yeah, it was a real it really took the air out of their sails, that Brighton defeat, and then they had to sit on it for 2 weeks, which Ange revealed was a pretty miserable experience from him. But he's also given him perspective, and he's had a chance to really delve into the numbers, try and work out just what the heck happened in that second half. And that was the question I put to him, having had 2 weeks to sort of ruminate on it. What actually happened? Why do you think this happened? Even though that's sort of looking back a bit, I feel like it's still so relevant to the whole Postecoglou way. The scepticism around his approach was almost crystallised in that one particular second half, where all the doubters would have extra ammunition to doubt him from that particular performance. And he came up with something very specific, which was quite interesting. He talked about how he couldn't just, get angry and that wouldn't really work for the players. He had to give them something specific to digest when it came to analysing that performance. And the specific performance of that was, the specific answer to that was some running numbers, some running stats, which I found very interesting. So he said the statistics showed how passive they were. In the open section earlier and after the game, he talked about how passive the team were. But specifically, he talks about how Spurs pride themselves, Ange Postecoglou's Spurs pride themselves on being the fittest team in the league, being the most intense team in the league. And essentially, they just weren't running enough in the second half. He talks about how the running stats, the running numbers they were putting up, dropped by 20 to 30% in that period after the break, where they conceded 3 goals to Brighton in 18 minutes. He's still trying to delve into why that happened. His sort of theory is that maybe the players thought that they could kind of weather the storm early second half, as many teams try to do, and then finish strong. But he doesn't think his team is built that way. They can't really do it that way. They've got to maintain that intensity. And that is why he felt like the result happened. They literally weren't doing enough running. And they'd lost that intensity that is a cornerstone of an Ange Postecoglou team. He said you can't even blame tiredness, because it was at the start of the second half. It wasn't like towards the end of the game. He's aware that his team plays with intensity, so tiredness, it may be a factor at times, but not at that stage of the game, particularly this early on in the season. And I think that's an interesting observation, but it does kind of beg the question, and to be honest, we didn't actually ask it. Maybe we should have. It felt like a bit sort of harking back to something that happened 2 weeks ago, which I know I'm doing here, but we're now also, from a press conference point of view, from where we do with the journalists, we do focus on things that happen, but most of the time we're trying to focus on what's coming next. So perhaps this was a bit of a, if we'd gone down this road, we may have been looking back too much on it. But it is a relevant follow-up to his point, is why not make substitutions then? I mean, he was asked after the game why he left it to the 78th minute to make changes, and at the time he batted it away, saying it was irrelevant and he wouldn't have changed much. But I think, as I said in the reaction to that press conference in that game at the time, I just felt like that was a classic Ange. In the wake of a result like that, he needs more time to think about it, and I don't even really fully believe when he answers a question like that, that's what he really thinks. He just, is still stewing very early on from an emotional response on a bad result. But I do think now if his analysis is that the team stopped running or stopped running at the level he wants them to, there is fair criticism to say that maybe he could have changed it up earlier, specifically in that game to counter that. I mean, maybe those numbers you don't get in real time, and it was just something that he sort of sensed at the time that has now later been backed up by looking at the data. But perhaps, I do think if fans are going to come at him with criticism of not making changes in that particular game, or if this happens again going forward, I think that probably is fair criticism, to be fair, because bringing in a player or a couple of players to add to literally do the legwork at that point may have been the difference between winning and losing, if his assessment of the reason why they lost was due to the lack of running. So I think that's fair comment. I also asked him about when you get a result like that, or a defeat like that, a specific defeat like that, where you've gone from being 2-0 up and then you've thrown it away. Often what is thrown at your door is a lack of leadership, lack of leaders in the team. I don't know whether that's a lazy criticism or something that's quite spot on. You do hear it from a lot of ex-players, and I think it's often, pundits, ex-players can, because they're on TV a lot. I mean, there is such thing as obviously as lazy punditry, but I do often think people don't quite give the credit that they deserve. They're the ones who've played the game at the highest level, and often if they're on Sky, they're really top players. So if that's what they're talking about, we should listen about potentially a lack of leadership being an issue. But at the same time, it could also be something that's just an easy thing to jump to when you get a result like this. But anyway, I put it to him saying, basically, is that something that is fair to criticise the supposed lack of leaders in the team when you get a result like that? Or is that something you're hoping the team improves upon? He's obviously got a leadership group with Son, the captain, who obviously wasn't playing. He was injured, so that's a key point, that his main leader wasn't there. And then he's got the vice captains of Maddison, Romero, Vicario, who are all playing, to be fair. And to be fair, as often Ange is in a pre-match press conference, he's a little less combative and a bit more reflective. And he took the point and was kind of saying, first of all, he felt like it's a bit of a trap to fall into the idea that it's all about a captain or captains, because sometimes it could be the point that the captain himself is not playing very well. It's about a collective, and it's about the fact that any one player, even the most inexperienced player, can show leadership with sort of one act to reinvigorate the team and get them refocused. So he's very much about every individual having responsibility when it comes to that side of things. But he also did basically admit that no one really did step up on that front. In that moment, they were maybe looking at someone like Romero to do it, whereas perhaps they're the ones that should have had that moment of responsibility. And that is something that he wants his team to grow into. He wants the likes of Brennan Johnson, he wants the likes of Mickey van der Ven to be those people who can inspire others with their sort of moments of taking the ball by the horns and showing responsibility and showing leadership. He was asked about Romero, as he's often a subject that comes up at the moment in these performances, particularly because he's vice captain, he's a World Cup winner. And he does say with Romero, look, he's not a big talker, not one of those captains, not a Roy Keane type, but he leads by example. And he's not going to be, and Postecoglou is not going to ask him to change, doesn't think that's going to be sort of particularly conducive to improving that. But it was interesting that he felt like, as a team, and not surprising because it's quite a young team, I suppose, that he wants to see more people taking on leadership roles, even if they're not in the leadership group. But I don't know, it'd be interesting to see what fans think. Do they feel like there is an issue there? I know that my good friends Dan Kilpatrick and Tom Allnut of the Standard and Times on a podcast, The Tottenham Way, talked about this. Tom Allnut in particular, talking about the likes of Lloris and Dyer and Kane leaving in recent years. Those big sort of senior figureheads who are big leaders in the dressing room having gone now, a younger dressing room now. And is that an issue when it comes to these kind of moments? I suppose if they happen more and more frequently, where they show this kind of brittle side of things, then it may well be a fair criticism. And there are times when, and I think Tom was making the point actually, where when a team is on top against Spurs for sort of 20-minute period in games, which can happen, they do often make it count. They do score in that period. like we saw with Leicester after dominating the first half. Spurs didn't score as many goals as they should have. They then had this moment when they're on the back foot and Leicester scored and could have scored again, to be fair. That would be quite a good example of that. And if that is happening more and more often, then maybe that does point to a lack of leadership, or at least a lack of experience in the team. And perhaps that's again on Postecoglou to manage that situation better, like what I was saying about maybe changing the game up and bringing subs on at the time. I can see why fans would be thinking that way. I think that's fair. And I think he probably sort of admit that that's something he needs to take on as well. And then just finally, he was also asked about this idea that the team can that Tottenham have a sort of issue historically over having a bit of a soft centre, which has led to this Spursy tag. Dan Kilpatrick was on the podcast was talking about the kind of similarities between Conte's sort of crazy press conference at Southampton, where he accused all the players of being selfish and basically being almost a weak mentality. Not saying that's the same as what Postecoglou was saying, but the fact that Postecoglou was pointing towards a lack of competitiveness, it was in a less accusatory style. He was trying to like help them rather than sort of damn the whole thing like Conte was at the time. But there were sort of hallmarks there that were similar, Dan argued anyway. And Dan put it to him in the press conference today. Do you feel like you can change that narrative, to change that whole issue that's at the core has been at the core of Spurs for so many years, hence that stat about throwing games away? And his response was brilliant. He just said, yeah, of course I believe that. If I didn't, I'd be stealing a living. He knew what he was getting into. He knew the history. He knew how long it had been since they hadn't won a trophy. He knew all these things that had cropped up. And he said, talk about taking responsibility. If it doesn't work and I don't change it, it is on me. It's not on the club. I'm the one who knew what, again, I was getting into and what I would and what I was facing, and the fact that I would need to face up to this and to realise that if it doesn't work out under me, then it's down to me. So I think, once again, Postecoglou speaking very, very interestingly and intelligently in his press conference off the back of a bad result. But again, as I've said many times, it all comes down to results. And when it comes to West Ham on Saturday, it's a huge game for him again, with which a bad result would only add further fuel to the doubters that I talked about earlier. But let's see how it goes. We'll not be surprised they came back with a sort of dynamic performance, which reinvigorated his whole tenure. So let's see.